When nightfall came on December 8, 1980, it didn't seem like it would be a particularly memorable evening. On Monday Night Football, the New England Patriots were scheduled to face off against the Miami Dolphins, and Stevie Wonder was set to play a concert at Oakland Coliseum. In New York City, it was a mild day, especially so late into the fall, with temperatures reaching over 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside his Manhattan apartment, John Lennon, music icon, founding member of the Beatles, and poster child of the 1960s counterculture movement, signed an autograph for an adoring fan. That fan's name was Mark David Chapman, and by the end of the evening, he would be forever known as the man who killed John Lennon. Let's back things up a bit, though, to Liverpool, England almost 40 years earlier. On October 9, 1940, John Winston Lennon was born in Liverpool Maternity Hospital. He was the son of merchant seaman Alfred Lennon and waitress Julia Lennon. From the very beginning, it was clear that John's life would be anything but boring. In fact, he basically faced hardship from the day of his birth, being born in the middle of the Second World War at the peak of the Luftwaffe air raids on Great Britain. John's father wasn't at the hospital to witness his birth, and this would prove prophetic of how their relationship would be for the early years of Lennon's life. Alfred wasn't around much, and Julia basically raised the infant John herself. Alfred did send money to her as a means of financial support, but that stopped in 1943 when he went absent from his job without leave. Julia ended up getting involved with another man after that, although Alfred did try to come back into her and John's lives, but was understandably rebuked. And ultimately, Julia and her new husband, John Dykes, became the primary guardians of John. However, this wasn't to last. Julia's family didn't like the fact that their technically still married daughter was seeing and living with another man, which was a huge social taboo in those days. And they felt she was a bit of a neglectful mother. Even worse, according to Julia's family, Dykes was also abusive, and they were understandably worried for John's safety. Sometimes things would get so bad at home that John would run away to his Aunt Mimi's house. After her family issued several complaints to Child Services, Julia reluctantly signed custody of John over to Mimi and her husband George. Julia would continue to have a relationship with John for the rest of her life, and as we'll see, she was a massive influence on the man he would become. Thanks in large part to his mother, John developed a great interest in music at a young age. Julia liked to listen to artists like Elvis Presley and Fats Domino, and when John would visit her, he quickly found himself falling in love with the music. He loved it so much that he started learning to play the harmonica, the guitar, and eventually the keyboard. At 15, he formed a rock and roll band called the Quarrymen with some friends, and the group started playing at local nightclubs. During the band's second performance, a man named Paul McCartney showed up to watch and was extremely impressed by John's musical talent. McCartney was a musician himself, who played the guitar and had started to dabble in songwriting. He befriended John, but the two never actually talked about music and eventually just went their separate ways. Nah, I'm kidding. It worked out pretty well for both of them. Eventually, Paul was invited to join the Quarrymen as a rhythm guitar player. He and John developed a very close relationship and began writing songs together. The group brought in Paul's friend George Harrison to play lead guitar, and John invited his friend Stuart Sutcliffe to come play bass, eventually changing their name to the Beatles in 1960. John had met Stuart at the Liverpool College of Arts, where he would also eventually meet his first wife, Cynthia Powell, and don't worry, we're definitely going to talk about her. Stuart wasn't much of a musician. He was going to school to focus on becoming a painter, but McCartney and Lennon liked having him around so much they basically just talked him into buying a bass and coming to hang with the boys. Lennon and Sutcliffe would become very close friends and eventually decided to split an apartment together. Unfortunately, Stuart's time with the Beatles would end tragically in just a couple of years, and as we'll see, tragedy and loss seemed to permeate so much of John's all too short life. Julia was unexpectedly killed in 1958 when she was hit by a car driven by an off-duty police officer. The officer was investigated but acquitted of all wrongdoing, as the courts ruled it accidental. This was immensely traumatizing for John, and her loss would affect him for the rest of his life, with much of the music he would write later on being influenced by the pain he felt over her death, if not outright dedicated to her memory. And it's really heartbreaking that Julia, the very person who had lit the fires of her son's music interest, wasn't around to see the heights he would eventually rise to. Shortly after his mother's death, John began dating Cynthia Powell. The two knew each other from school and had always been flirtatious, but at the time both were seeing people, and Cynthia was even engaged to be married. By fall of 1958, though, they had become so enamored with one another that they broke off both their current relationships to be together. They would go on to marry in 1962 when Cynthia found out she was pregnant with John's child. Before we get ahead of ourselves, though, we're going to need to address the elephant that is no doubt going to appear in the room soon. John, by his own admission, was very jealous and insecure. This at times would manifest itself into angry outbursts and even physical violence, most infamously at a party early on in the couple's relationship, where John slapped Cynthia after seeing her dancing with Stuart Sutcliffe. The force of the blow caused Cynthia to hit her head against the wall, and she broke up with John immediately after, but did eventually take him back a couple of months later. While Cynthia has never revealed any additional stories of John being physically violent with her, Lennon himself admitted that he had a history of abusing women. According to him and people who knew him, his struggle with his violent tendencies played a large part in John becoming such a huge advocate for peace and love later in life. As a result of this, a lot of people find their enjoyment of his work as an artist is now diminished. And look, I get it. As fans of media, we have to constantly ask ourselves if the sins of the artist overwrite the quality of their work and their contribution to their craft. That's a question that you honestly have to answer for yourself. For us, it's important to give you the information as best we can, and it was a very real part of John as a person that deserves mentioning. For the Beatles, 1960 marked the start of what would end up being almost 6 straight years of non-stop touring. In the 2-year period between 1960 and 1962, the group would periodically stay in Hamburg, West Germany for several months, playing an exhaustive schedule of shows at nightclubs throughout the city, then return home to the UK and play an equally torrid pace of shows before heading back to Germany every few months. Things were off to a rocky start, though, as the group desperately needed a drummer. In what was basically an 11th hour hire, they settled on Pete Best and left for the first of their many trips to Hamburg over the next 2 years. This would eventually lead to them meeting their future drummer and future manager, but it wasn't exactly a place to write home about. A lot of these clubs were in the infamous red light district, where drugs and sex could be found as easily as music. The Beatles would eventually catch the attention of a man named Brian Epstein. Epstein was a record store owner who had no prior experience in the music industry. But when he came and watched the Beatles perform, he saw immense potential in them. He eventually became their manager and a particularly close friend of John's. John respected Epstein's vision for the band and trusted his guidance, which was a sentiment that the others shared. Brian convinced the guys to ditch the greaser look and go with something more minimal and clean, correctly calculating this would make the group's appearance more palatable for a mainstream audience. Immediately after agreeing to a contract with the group, Epstein got to work finding them a record deal. Soon after this, though, tragedy would once again make an appearance in John's life, as he was about to lose a dear friend not even 5 years after losing his mother. For Stuart Sutcliffe, the pace they were performing shows at was becoming too much. Remember, he was kinda just in this to hang out with his friends, and now they were getting blitzed in German strip clubs playing for hours on end. So the guy kinda wanted a break. He eventually started taking more shows off and accompanying them on fewer Hamburg trips, electing to spend more time at school focusing on art. While home on one such trip in April 1962, Sutcliffe died of a brain aneurysm at just 21 years old. John reportedly broke down sobbing when he heard the news of Stuart's death. The two hadn't been as close in recent years as they were when John first got the Beatles together, but Stewart was still one of his best friends and the loss greatly affected him. Rather than replace Sutcliffe, it was decided that Paul would just play bass from now on, making Harrison the group's lone guitarist. Internally, the Beatles were also starting to sour on Best as a drummer. He didn't really seem to gel well with the other three, and Epstein personally wasn't a fan of his. Eventually, they met talented drummer and all-around good guy Ringo Starr. He'd played a couple of shows as a fill-in for Best, but was in a band at the time called Rory and the Hurricanes, though he would eventually leave them to join the Beatles, replacing Best in the summer of 1962. As if all this band turmoil and personal loss wasn't enough for John, he found out that same year that Cynthia was pregnant with a child. He decided upon hearing this that the time had come to marry his longtime girlfriend, and the two officially became husband and wife on August 23, 1962. As much of a roller coaster as John's life had been, he could barely imagine how much crazier things were going to get, as the next several years would bring him to a level of stardom he could barely have imagined at the time. Epstein wanted to capitalize on the success the group was having around Europe, and secured a deal with EMI Records and producer George Martin. He wanted to get them in the studio immediately to record an album, and in October 1962 they released their first single, Love Me Do, which had moderate radio success. Their second single, Please Please Me, which was also going to be the title of their debut album, came out a few months later and fared much better, peaking at number 2 on the UK charts. Then their music started spreading like wildfire and had UK airwaves in a death grip. In February 1963, they went in for a studio recording session and basically hammered out the entire Please Please Me album by the end of the day. John and Paul had become like brothers at this point and had spent a great deal of time writing songs together. So when the band's big moment finally came, they were well prepared. They forged an agreement in 1962 that anything the two wrote while members of the Beatles would be credited to the Lennon-McCartney partnership. By the end, this partnership would produce almost 200 songs and become one of the most successful songwriting collaborations in music history. Please Please Me released in April of 1963, taking the number 1 spot on the UK charts. It would be the first of 11 straight albums to achieve a similar feat. And when their third single, She Loves You, came out in August of 1963, it was the fastest selling record in UK history at the time. Beatlemania had officially arrived. That same year, John and Cynthia welcomed a baby boy, who they named Julian. Julian's relationship with his father would prove to be a complicated one. Just like Alfred with him, John was not present for his son's birth, and also like Alfred, this would prove to be representative of a trend in Julian's life, with John being, quite frankly, very absent in it, to the point where growing up, Julian said he actually looked at Paul as more of a father figure than his own dad. It's definitely an awkward relationship in many ways, and we'll talk more about Cynthia and Julian's relationship with John when You Know Who pops into the picture. But for now, let's leave it at that. By the end of 1963, the Beatles had taken over the UK, thanks in large part to Paul and John writing hit songs with seemingly the same amount of effort it takes an average person to change their socks. They were getting plenty of attention outside of Europe as well, and decided to take their act international. They first set their sights on the US, where they received a welcome unlike anything most celebrities could ever imagine. When landing at the JFK airport, they were greeted by over 4,000 fans. An appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show broadcast the Beatles into millions of homes a few days later, and within weeks, Beatlemania caught the US in its grip as well. John and his ragtag group of bandmates were unknowingly the spearhead in what would be dubbed the British Invasion, with other rock bands from the UK breaking into international stardom throughout the coming years after the Beatles had opened the door. These years brought them to the level of worldwide superstars, as their music became beloved around the globe and the string of albums all released between 1964 and 1966 being widely regarded by many fans as the band's prime. For John and his bandmates, though, these years proved stressful on their personal lives. Lennon later remarked that when he wrote the group's 1965 hit Help, he imagined it as a literal cry for help because the sudden fame made him feel suffocated. The constant cycle of touring, then going to the studio to record, then back on the road, had wore the guys down quickly. In 1965, both John and George were introduced to LSD, and it was a drug they would both become very fond of. It was John's first step into the growing counterculture movement that we know these days as hippies, and within a few short years, John would become a central figure of this movement. Also, the more recognition the group received, the more they were doing interviews and speaking with the public. John, who had always been somewhat prone to make colorful comments, was prime fodder for tabloids in both the UK and US. Most infamously in 1966 when he said, quote, "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." In the UK, this wasn't actually seen as anything controversial. But in America, well, America pulled in America. Ironically, the comments weren't picked up by US publications until 5 months after Lennon had originally made them. When newspapers did finally make the comments public in the US, they sparked a massive outrage, particularly in the very religious South. Beatles albums were set on fire, and many stores stopped carrying their music for fear of being vandalized. This caused the group's final US tour in 1966 to be marred with protest and threats of violence. Epstein was forced to cancel some shows out of safety concerns for the band. For his part, John apologized profusely and insisted he wasn't saying the band was better than Jesus, as so many of those angry at him had suggested. The public actually seemed to accept this apology, and remember, America had all that Vietnam civil rights stuff going on, so it was never really going to stick in the headlines. Things would eventually calm down, but John would go on to find himself at the center of controversy for much of the next decade. The whole experience of the 1966 US tour had solidified John and the others' feelings that they wanted to take a break from touring and finally have a chance to stop and breathe for the first time since the roller coaster took off 3 years ago. They decided they would take a break from touring that was originally supposed to be temporary. On August 29, 1966, the group played the final show of their tour in San Francisco's Candlestick Park. This would prove to be the Beatles' final paid concert, and they would only play one more live show together before breaking up. Epstein pressured them to make the hiatus as short as possible. However, the others soundly rejected this every time it was brought up, and the hiatus that was originally supposed to only last a few months went on for much longer. John had increased his LSD use and really wanted to evolve the Beatles' sound into something more raw and edgy. Lennon was always on the cutting edge of the music industry, and saw the Beatles as a group that needed to basically grow up. It was a transition that was clearly already happening, as you can see a very stark difference between something like Please Please Me and Revolver. But on the next album, that transformation would come full circle. At the beginning of 1967, they started working on their 8th album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Lennon, who was on acid almost constantly at this point, poured every bit of himself into this record, writing more legendary songs on one album than most musicians will in a lifetime, which included Strawberry Fields, A Day in the Life, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and All You Need Is Love. The last of which became a banner song for the Summer of Love movement later that year, which had risen up in protest of the Vietnam War. McCartney later described the band's attitude as almost angry during the writing process, fed up with the clean-cut mop look Epstein had carefully crafted for them. The result was not only arguably the most famous Beatles album of all time, but according to many, the single greatest album ever made. In one fell swoop, John and the others had gone from a band feeling stagnant to becoming arguably the most influential band in the music industry. For Lennon, this marked a big moment in not just his professional life, but his personal one as well. He and Cynthia were starting to have problems, with John regularly absent from the lives of both his wife and son. She would later blame what happened with John on his acid use, but either way, the result was a relationship that wasn't going to last much longer. While boarding a flight to go on a vacation to Greece, a police officer didn't recognize Cynthia and she wasn't permitted on the plane. She would later remark that for her, this was the moment their marriage ended, as the next time she saw her husband, he would be sitting in their living room wearing bathrobes with a young Japanese artist by the name of Yoko Ono. Yoko had originally met John when she attempted to get a manuscript from a Lennon-McCartney song for a project her colleague was working on. Paul declined, but John ended up giving her a copy of one of his, and later ran into her again at an art exhibit she was participating in. The attraction between the two was pretty much instantaneous, and what began as them just writing letters to each other bloomed into a full-blown romantic affair by the end of 1967. When 1968 rolls around, John is basically done with his marriage and is taking little effort to hide the fact he's spending almost all of his time with Yoko. And as we all know, his relationship with Ono would be a defining feature of the rest of Lennon's life. John had taken up transcendental meditation along with George. George had actually stopped using drugs altogether, which was an accomplishment he credited to becoming a more spiritual person. John famously disliked religion, but he figured out of all of them, Hinduism seemed the most harmless, and if it had such a profound impact on his buddy, then there had to be something there. They invited Paul and Ringo to join them on a meditation retreat led by Maharishi Yogi, not long after the release of Sgt. Pepper's. But their trip was cut short as tragedy would yet again strike. Brian Epstein was found dead in his home of an accidental prescription drug overdose on August 27, 1967. Working the last several years as the Beatles' manager had been an exhausting and stressful job. Epstein already lived in a constant state of paranoia and fear, being a closeted homosexual living in the UK, where homosexuality was illegal at the time. The band had all known of Brian's sexual orientation and were fine with it, but it resulted in several blackmail attempts by people threatening to reveal to the world Epstein was gay. The increased paranoia from living in fear of such threats, plus the stress of managing the biggest rock band in the world, had him relying on pills to wake up and go to sleep. In August 1967, he took what was a normal prescribed dose of his sleeping medication, but was also drinking on top of it. When he laid down, his body gave out, and he died at just 32 years old. The Beatles were distraught over the death of their trusted manager. To add salt to the wound, the group didn't even get to attend his funeral because they feared it would draw a circus of fans and media. Brian's death would prove to be a fatal wound that the band would never recover from. Lennon said that in the aftermath of Epstein's passing, he questioned how the Beatles would even go on, and the answer was they would spend the next couple of years dying a slow death. In the immediate aftermath, though, the group did rally around each other, and ended up leaning into spiritualism for support and guidance. In February of 1968, they went on another retreat led by Yogi. The group was going to be accompanied by several celebrities as well, among them Mia Farrow. And it was this huge deal because the Beatles' interest in transcendental meditation had made it something of a fad in the West. This trip wouldn't be cut short by tragedy, thankfully, but that couldn't save it from being a complete shit show. When they first got there, they tried to use the time away with relative peace and quiet to write music, and did manage to write a good number of songs that would go on their next album. However, during this process, creative differences started to arise, particularly with Paul and John. We'll put a pin in that for now, but let's just say things get a little awkward.
How do you sleep, you cunt?
Paul and Ringo left after just a couple of weeks, becoming very jaded on the whole experience very quickly. George and John, who were much more invested, stayed another 6 weeks or so, but things became testy between them and their mentor. John and George's entourage would regularly violate the retreat's rules around drugs and alcohol, namely that you weren't supposed to do them. John also accused Yogi of sexual misconduct with the female students and staff. The whole thing was just a mess. John and George would leave in the middle of April, with some accounts saying they were asked to leave by Yogi after he got tired of dealing with their friend's shit, while others say it was voluntary and it was in fact John and George who were fed up and didn't want to deal with a creepy old man leeching off of their fame. This bitter end led to a very public denouncement of Yogi by the entire band that pretty much destroyed his reputation in the West, along with the reputation of his meditation practices for a number of years. George would later recant this, saying that he and John were just being kind of assholes and that Yogi didn't really do anything to deserve putting up with that. So just an overall terrible time for everyone involved. Paul tried to take over as de facto leader after Brian's death, but this ran into problems immediately. For starters, John and the others simply did not respect him the same way they did Epstein. That might sound kinda mean, but imagine your manager leaves your job and your buddy in the cubicle next to you starts bossing everyone around, and you can kinda see where they were coming from. Secondly, it seems that without Epstein, the creative differences within the group started to finally come to the forefront. Paul and John had always had different approaches to writing music, as I said earlier, and for a long time those styles had been peanut butter and jelly. Now though, they were starting to turn into peanut butter and motor oil. John felt Paul's style was too soft and safe, unaffectionately referring to it as, quote, granny music, while Paul was worried that John's taste was getting so far out there that anyone who wasn't on as much acid as he was wouldn't be able to actually enjoy it. Fans who prefer one over the other tend to apply these very uncharitable labels to the one they don't like as much, and yeah, it's just stupid, don't do it. On the other side of this, you had George, who'd become a very talented songwriter in his own right, becoming very frustrated that his ideas were being ignored. The group had certainly given Harrison more creative freedom over the years, but it wasn't quite as much as George wanted. He felt he could write just as good as Paul and John, and he wanted to be taken just as seriously. This wasn't empty gusto either. The guy could write some good music, as he would prove by having arguably the best solo career of all four Beatles. He wanted more input and very much deserved it. In mid-1968, the Beatles began recording the White Album, which was marred by an infamously bad series of studio sessions where the band couldn't seem to agree on anything. Ringo even famously quit for several weeks after being fed up with all the fighting and irritated that he was being given very little opportunity to show his talents as a drummer. They were also under a lot of pressure at the time trying to get their own publishing company, Apple Records, off the ground, which was not off to a great start. John would later go so far as to say, quote, "You could hear the Beatles breaking up on that album." He and Yoko's relationship was in full swing by this point, with Cynthia having filed for divorce after coming home and finding John and Yoko together. Initially, Lennon said he wanted custody of Julian, but eventually agreed to let his son stay with Cynthia. Julian took his parents' divorce hard, and it further soured his already frail relationship with his father. John still maintained some contact with Julian and Cynthia for the remainder of his life, but it was minimal, and he would leave very little for either of them in his will. This would cause a long-held public grudge by Julian against his father well into his adulthood, with him only recently seeming willing to move on from it. As to why John was like this with Cynthia and his son, I really couldn't say, but you can't help but see how all this went down and feel a little bad for both of them. The Beatles were coming apart at the seams, and to make matters worse, the group was in conflict about basically every single aspect of Apple Records, which was just hemorrhaging money left and right at this point. This would evolve into further legal battles after the Beatles' breakup, aka the Everybody Hates Paul era. Even worse, the group had hired a man named Alan Klein to replace Epstein, selecting him over McCartney's soon-to-be in-laws, a decision that Paul obviously wasn't a fan of. This would prove to be one of the times McCartney was right, though, as Klein would show to be a very shady businessman who basically just milked as much money out of the group as he could while doing very little actual managing. All of this could be a video of its own, so I won't talk too much about it here, but suffice to say, things were not looking bright for the Beatles' future. One major source of tension during the recording of the White Album was John's insistence on having Yoko in the studio with him basically all the time. The band had a rule against girlfriends and other guests in the studio and were very strict about who they let come listen to them record. But Lennon gave an ultimatum, saying it was either going to be both of them or none of them. John was completely infatuated with Yoko, and for better or worse, the two would basically be connected at the hip for the remainder of Lennon's life. The others reluctantly agreed because what were they going to do, record without John Lennon? So Yoko became a regular fixture for the group's remaining sessions. Lennon and Ono also started working on music together. In fact, when Cynthia had come home and discovered the two of them, they had been up on an all-night acid trip where they recorded a series of songs that would go on to be released as an album titled Two Virgins. An album so incredibly and utterly bad that the only thing anyone remembers from it is the fact that the cover was a picture of John and Yoko naked. This was only the third album released by Apple Records, and it took John over 6 months to convince his bandmates to publish it. Its release was equally sad, as it peaked at the esteemed 124th spot on the US charts, didn't even chart in the UK of all places, and sold a paltry 25,000 copies. It, by any metric you want to use, was such a poorly received album that a more fragile-egoed musician might have just retired. John Lennon, though? You know what a mad lad like John Lennon does? He releases a sequel album the very next year. I mean, it somehow manages to do even worse than the first one, but goddamn if I don't admire the confidence. If I believed in myself that much, it probably wouldn't take us 6 months to make a video. By 1969, John was clearly more invested in his music with Yoko than he was with the Beatles. Together with her, he made the Plastic Ono Band, and the two were married in March of 1969. The anti-war effort was something John was about to become very passionate about, and would remain so through the end of Vietnam. At their wedding, they announced they would be spending their honeymoon doing a series of sleep-in protests against the war. The idea of the sleep-in was basically the two sitting in their bed for a week while occasionally giving interviews to the news about why they were doing this. Many commentators mocked this demonstration as little more than a publicity stunt, while others celebrated Lennon for continuing to take a stand against what they saw as an unjust war. The first bed-in was in Amsterdam between March 25th and March 31st of 1969. They planned on staging a second one in the US, however, they were denied entry into the country. Lennon's vocal anti-war rhetoric had put him firmly in the crosshairs of the US government, specifically the FBI, who labeled Lennon a subversive agent and conducted surveillance on him and Yoko for the better part of the next decade. The Nixon administration would even attempt to deport him from the country during the 1970s. No matter how hard he tried, Lennon seemed always to be at the center of controversy. This caused them to divert to Montreal and stage the bed-in there from May 26th to June 1st. During the second one, John wrote the song Give Peace a Chance, and it would go on to become his first solo hit single as well as a prominent anti-war song. That same year, John and Yoko began experimenting with heroin and would soon become full-fledged addicts. This further strained John's already frail relationship with his bandmates, and that relationship was about to shatter completely. Just a few months after the exhaustive recording process of the White Album, the four came together for what would end up being their last few studio sessions as a band. The music from these sessions would go on to form Abbey Road and Let It Be, the group's final 2 studio albums. Martin and the rest of their management had come up with the idea of recording an album, playing the whole thing on a live televised concert, then heading off on a world tour to promote the impending release. On top of this, they made a deal with documentary maker Michael Lindsay Hogg that he could record the studio sessions and release them in a film that would be titled Let It Be. However, things hit a wall almost immediately. Lennon was completely addicted to heroin at this point, and at times seemed to hold outright contempt for his bandmates and their musical ability, with McCartney again being the primary target of his frustrations. He was often late to recordings, and by this point couldn't even function without Yoko by his side. These tensions reached their peak when George quit the band at one point and only returned after heavy concessions were made. one such concession being the cancellation of the planned tour. For a while, the live show was even in limbo, but it was eventually decided they'd go through with it, resulting in the famous concert atop of Apple Records in January 1969, the last time the Beatles played a live show together. Their next album was supposed to be Let It Be, but the group wasn't happy with the final mix, bringing in producer and part-time actress murderer Phil Spector to try and salvage the recordings into something. Let It Be, the album and film, would eventually release in 1970, with the band famously not being a fan of either, but for now the whole project was on the shelf. They would go on to finish recording and release Abbey Road later that year, which was the final album the four recorded together. In September of 1969, Lennon told his bandmates he was leaving, and the Beatles officially broke up. John entered 1970 something of an angry man. He was finally free of what he saw as constraints imposed on him by McCartney, but still held some pretty deep-seated resentment toward his former bandmate, particularly when Paul broke the group's agreement not to announce the breakup before a certain date when he released his first solo album, McCartney, in April of 1970. This was less a true album and more kind of just Paul sitting in his backyard depressed all day recording anything that came to mind. It didn't review all that well, and the biggest news from it was an announcement that he was leaving the Beatles on the inside cover. John was reportedly furious, and this just added to a lot of difficult feelings for him at the time, as he and Yoko had just recently kicked their heroin addiction. Never ones to shy away from New Age medicine, the two entered into a new type of therapy created by author Janoke called primal therapy. There is way too much to unpack here, and this video is long enough without me giving you the full rundown, but the long and short is a therapist tries to force repressed pain out of you, theorizing that holding pain in is actually what causes your mental illness. In addition to undergoing this therapy, John and Yoko went to work on their own albums, releasing them as a double album in December of that year, neatly titled Plastic Ono Band. John was extremely proud of the music he did for this album, even referring to it as Sgt. Lennon as an obvious play on Sgt. Pepper's. Every song was extremely personal to John, and he addressed several heavy moments in his life, like his mother's death and his love-hate relationship with the Beatles, though at this point it was very much leaning towards the hate direction. However, upon its release, it had a so-so commercial performance. The darker subject matter and sometimes uncomfortable tone of the album made it a huge turnoff for mainline Beatles fans. The critics were much kinder, with the positive reviews going so far as to declare it Lennon's best work, period. The album's lukewarm sales hurt John, especially given the fact that his former bandmate George Harrison dropped the absolutely iconic All Things Must Pass a few weeks prior to John's album and just blew it out of the water commercially. Yoko's half of the dual release was not so well received. At the time, there were two main camps among Beatles fans. One camp feeling that the breakup was 100% Yoko's fault, Yoko was completely to blame, and no one else did anything wrong. The other was the Paul's a douche camp, stating that McCartney's ego had become so huge, the rest of the band just couldn't stand to deal with him anymore. Both of these theories are wrong and unfair for a number of reasons. I mean, there's plenty to dislike about Yoko. We don't need to pin the entire Beatles breakup on her alone. As far as McCartney is concerned, the fact that he was involved in a lawsuit against the other three really didn't do him any favors. Then on his second album release, Ram, there were several lyrics that John and the others took as slightly indirect shots at them, further solidifying the Nobody Likes Paul camp into their positions. Ram was actually a pretty good album, but reviews at the time were incredibly uncharitable as so many people blamed the Beatles' breakup on him, with retrospective reviews being much nicer. Good album or not though, John didn't appreciate being called out like that, and he was never one to back down from a fight. When he went back into the studio to begin work on his second solo album, Imagine, John decided to take a shot back at Paul. That's right, guys and gals, we have an official rap beef on our hands. Paul hadn't challenged John to a freestyle battle or anything like that, but he had taken some light indirect shots at him. John decided the most effective response would be to make his return fire anything but indirect. He wrote the song How Do You Sleep, where he just completely eviscerates Paul, essentially calling him a talentless bum who got lucky the one time he wrote Yesterday and was never going to be worth a shit as a musician outside of that. It is brutal stuff, and basically boils down to the Paul McCartney Sucks song. As juicy as the drama between McCartney and Lennon was, though, the title track would easily prove the most memorable part of the album. Imagine would go on to become Lennon's biggest post-Beatles career hit, with many viewing it as his signature song. A simple piano ballad asking for everyone to try and imagine a world where we can just work together and make a better life for ourselves and our neighbors. It is widely considered Lennon's magnum opus, but at the time, not everyone was impressed. Lennon moved to the US in 1971, and the government viewed his music and political opinions as promoting communism. The pressure put on Lennon by the FBI and the Nixon administration ratcheted up, beginning a multi-year court battle where the US government tried deporting the Lennons from the country. This went back and forth with the Lennons and the Nixon administration for years, with John and Yoko at one point hilariously declaring themselves citizens of the micronation Newtopia, which they founded in 1973 and then immediately asked for political asylum in the US. I don't think that's how it works, but points for creativity. The Lennons eventually won the case as Watergate destroyed Nixon's presidential career, and his successor, Gerald Ford, showed little interest in having a public dispute with one of the most popular rock stars in the world. While Imagine had been a massive hit, his next project with the Plastic Ono Band, 1972's Sometime in New York, was anything but. Panned by critics and a commercial flop, this marked the start of a very difficult time in John's life, where his relationship with Yoko unraveled and his professional success became very spotty. At the end of 1973, John began what he referred to as his lost weekend, where he and Yoko decided to go their separate ways after having severe difficulties in their marriage. They stopped short of a full-fledged divorce, but did go on to see other people. During this time, Lennon worked on his third solo album, Mind Games, and the chaos in his life at the time was a huge influence on the album's sound. Upon its release, it fared better than Sometime in New York, not that that's a very impressive bar to clear, but still saw lukewarm praise at best. John began dating a woman named May Pang, a relationship that Yoko oddly encouraged. By all accounts, while he was with May Pang, his attitude changed. He was making an attempt to reach out to Cynthia and Julian more. He was patching his relationship up with Paul as well. On the outside, things seemed more hopeful than they had been in a while. Sadly, none of this was meant to last, as John unceremoniously broke up with May Pang and got back together with Yoko in 1974. That year, he released his fifth solo album, Walls and Bridges, which did better than Mind Games, but still didn't reach the heights of Imagine. 1975's Rock and Roll, which again had a mixed critical reception, but did decent commercially. A short time later, Yoko became pregnant and gave birth to a son whom they named Sean. Perhaps in an attempt to make up for his failures with Julian, or just because he really did love Sean this much, John decided to take a hiatus from the music industry to be a stay-at-home dad. Between 1975 and 1980, John mainly stayed at his house, still working on music, but just waiting for the right time to release it as he enjoyed his life with Yoko and Sean. While fans around the world speculated when John would finally return, none of them thought about Lennon nearly as much as a man from Fort Worth, Texas, named Mark David Chapman. To call Chapman a person with some mental health issues would be a bit like saying life under the Taliban is a tad strict. Growing up in an abusive household, Mark fantasized about having godlike power and being able to control others, as he never seemed to have control of his own life. He had been a huge fan of the Beatles in their early years, but found Lennon's more popular than Jesus comments very off-putting, as he was raised in a very conservative Christian household. Initially, this was more of a "I'm not mad, just disappointed" kind of thing, but as Lennon became more politically outspoken over the following years, Chapman saw his hatred for him grow deeper and deeper. He'd also developed an obsession with the book The Catcher in the Rye, particularly its main character Holden Caulfield, an angsty 16-year-old on his way home to New York after getting kicked out of prep school, an infamously polarizing character who spends most of the novel walking around New York and narrating about how phony and fake the adult world is. Some, understandably, find this character incredibly cringe, but there is a deeper meaning as to why Holden acts this way, and if you want to dive into the story's themes, I would recommend the 2 videos Crash Course did on it. Chapman clearly didn't get what the novel was trying to say, and instead took a very surface-level view of it, modeling himself into what he saw as a no-nonsense truth-teller, calling the rest of the world out on its bullshit, but in reality just being a grossly unintelligent man, dedicating his whole life to becoming an, ironically, phony interpretation of a book character he didn't understand. As Lennon started his solo career and began to discuss things like religion and politics more in his music, Chapman found his hatred for his former idol reached a breaking point. Mark viewed Lennon as a hypocrite due to him holding what many saw as socialist sympathies, while also living in an expensive house and having lots of money. Also add the fact that John continued to write what Mark saw as blasphemy against God, and he was essentially public enemy number 1 as far as Chapman saw it. He started to fantasize about killing the rock star, simultaneously taking vengeance for God while also silencing someone he saw as yet another phony and fake adult. In interviews later, Chapman said that in reality he just wanted to be someone, feeling like a small person who wasn't in control of his own life and feeling hatred against John for all the love and attention he'd received. Regardless of the reasons though, Chapman had his sights firmly set on John, and the opportunity he was waiting for would come tragically soon. In 1980, after 5 years of being a stay-at-home dad, John had grown tired of his house and wanted to make a musical comeback. His next album, Double Fantasy, was announced and set for release the same year, composed mostly of stuff he'd written while on hiatus. It came out on November 17, 1980. Initial reviews were just okay, despite the first single off the album, Just Like Starting Over, picking up a fair bit of radio play and being an absolute banger of a song. A few short weeks later, though, the music landscape would be changed forever. The day began as smooth as one could ask, with John and Yoko scheduled to meet with a photographer, after which John had an interview set up and a meeting with some musicians he was working on a collaboration with. Chapman had planned to stake out John's apartment building. Lennon had been living in New York for 3 years, and had become a regular fixture among New York's nightlife. Basically everyone in the city knew where he lived, so it wasn't hard for Chapman to find him. Dressed in clothing meant to invoke Holden Caulfield, Chapman carried a worn copy of Catcher in the Rye, along with a copy of Double Fantasy and a .38 caliber revolver loaded with hollow point bullets. His plan was to ambush Lennon the very first moment he saw him. Chapman missed his initial opportunity, but spotted John and Yoko returning from their photo shoot together. For whatever reason, instead of following through with his plan then and there, Mark approached John and asked him to sign his copy of Double Fantasy as he and Yoko left their apartment to get in a limo around 5 p.m. John complied, not knowing he was giving an autograph to the man who would murder him later that night, and Chapman described him as very kind and patient. Chapman continued to wait out front the apartment building until the limo returned again at 10 p.m., this time to drop John and Yoko off. After Lennon got out and started walking towards his apartment building, Chapman emerged from the shadows and fired several shots at John. The singer was struck twice in his left side, with hollow-tipped bullets bouncing around and causing massive internal bleeding. John stumbled under the walkway leading to his building and collapsed on a staircase. Chapman, seemingly unfazed, simply put his gun down and sat on the curb where he was detained by security, who called the police. One of the responding officers reportedly asked him, "Do you know what you just did?" To which Chapman responded, "Yes, I shot John Lennon." Officers did their best to get John's bleeding under control, but it was simply too much. One of the police officers, named James Moran, decided to take his chances and drive John to the hospital himself rather than wait for an ambulance. Which, in all fairness, was probably the right call, it just unfortunately didn't make a difference. John's wounds had caused severe internal bleeding. One of the attending physicians who worked on him when he arrived at Roosevelt Hospital later remarked that it wouldn't have mattered if John was shot in the middle of an operating room with a team of surgeons on standby. He still wouldn't have survived. John was pronounced dead shortly arriving at the hospital. He was 40 years old. It didn't take long for news of John's death to travel. In fact, a reporter had just by coincidence been in the lobby of the hospital when he saw a despondent Yoko and realized what was going on. Howard Cosell and the rest of the Monday Night Football crew stopped mid-broadcast to inform the world of what happened, and Stevie Wonder took to the stage to deliver the devastating news to the crowd at his show. British tabloid reporters hounded McCartney and the other two Beatles for a comment literally minutes after the news broke. I mean, these are the guys who took pictures of Princess Diana as she lay in a car dying, so they aren't exactly known for their sensitivity. For Beatles fans, the murder was a double dose of pain, as not only had they lost one of their most beloved artists, but the chances now of the band ever reuniting were completely zero. For Yoko, being there for the death of her husband was one of the most traumatizing experiences of her life. I mean, regardless of your thoughts on the woman, the fact that she still has John's bloody glasses from the night he was killed sitting on her mantle pretty much tells you all you need to know. The day of his murder, December 8th, would hold an ominous place in the history of heavy metal as well, when guitarist Dimebag Darrell was killed exactly 24 years later, also murdered by an obsessed former fan. Chapman would go on to plead guilty and was given 20 years to life with the eligibility for parole, for which he has been denied 12 times as of the recording of this video. While Chapman might have succeeded in taking Lennon's life, his legacy in the music world is untouched and in many ways unrivaled to this day. As part of arguably the most famous band to ever exist, and as a prolific solo artist who, despite not reaching the same consistent levels of greatness on his own, still managed to make some of the most memorable music in history. Thanks as always for watching, and we will see you guys next time.